In the summer of 1941, deep within the captured territories of the Soviet Union, a small group of German engineers gathered around a strange, dented launcher that looked more like a farmer's broken machinery than a weapon of war. They had taken it from a battlefield near Smolensk, a captured Soviet rocket artillery truck, known among Red Army soldiers as Katyusha. The Germans had heard rumors about it long before they saw one up close. Soviet prisoners had whispered its name with fear, describing how entire platoons vanished under its screaming fire. Yet to the disciplined minds of German engineers, the weapon looked crude, unsophisticated, even childish. The engineers belonging to the Wehrmacht's Experimental Weapons Division had brought the strange contraption to a testing ground near Minsk. Their objective was to study Soviet innovation, measure its efficiency, and, if possible, improve upon it. But as they examined the launcher, laughter filled the air. The tubes were unevenly welded, the electrical ignition wires looked improvised, and the vehicle itself was nothing more than a converted Studebaker truck. The German specialists, used to the clean precision of Krupp steel and Siemens wiring, found it hard to believe such a contraption could terrify anyone. Yet the field officers standing nearby were less amused. They had seen what this Stalin's organ, as German troops mockingly called it, could do in combat. In the chaos near Smolensk, entire battalions had been pinned down by waves of howling rockets, unable to advance. Soldiers had described the sound as a metallic scream mixed with thunder. But here, under calm skies, surrounded by scientific minds and test instruments, the engineers only saw flaws, not terror. As the test prepared to begin, the laughter subsided. A single rocket was loaded onto the improvised rail. Instruments were set up, pressure gauges, timing devices, and blast sensors. The order was given to fire. The engineers stepped back, smiling, expecting a noisy failure, a demonstration of Soviet backwardness. What happened next would silence their laughter. The moment the ignition switch was thrown, a deafening shriek split the air. A burst of white smoke engulfed the truck, and the rocket tore through the sky with unnatural speed, leaving a glowing trail behind. Within seconds, it struck far beyond the test range, detonating with a roar that shook the ground and sent a shockwave through the observers. Dust filled the air. Even the stoic Wehrmacht officers flinched. The blast crater was enormous, deeper and wider than anyone had expected. When the smoke cleared, no one was laughing. The air still shimmered from the heat of the explosion. The German engineers, moments ago filled with smug disbelief, now stood frozen in silence. The crater before them was not just a hole in the ground. It was a message, written in smoke and dust, from the Soviet factories that had built this weapon under impossible conditions. One of the observers, a colonel from the artillery corps, muttered quietly that the blast radius exceeded that of any known German field rocket. Instruments lay toppled, and the wooden observation platform creaked under the vibration that still pulsed through the earth. In that instant, the engineers realized that this crude machine was more than a curiosity. It was a symbol of something far more dangerous: Soviet adaptability. The Germans had relied on precision manufacturing, on exactness and mechanical perfection. Yet here was a weapon forged in urgency, built in hidden workshops under bombardment, and still capable of unleashing terrifying destruction. They repeated the test, this time setting up measuring posts along a wider range. As another rocket was launched, its shriek pierced the calm Belarusian fields like a banshee's cry. Villagers miles away would later recall hearing it, an unnatural wail, followed by a rumble that made windows tremble. The engineers recorded the flight time, the exhaust temperature, and the fragmentation pattern. Every figure contradicted their expectations. The rocket's propulsion was unstable, yet strangely efficient. Its explosive payload produced a blast disproportionate to its size. And most impressive of all, the rapid reload capacity of the launcher meant that an entire battery could saturate an area before the enemy could react. Reports soon reached Berlin. The test documentation, signed by Oberstleutnant Hans Kepler, described the weapon as inelegant yet devastatingly effective. He compared it to a storm, uncontrollable, inaccurate, but catastrophic. The German High Command took note. Orders were sent to continue research, to reverse engineer the design, and to capture more units in the field. But even as the engineers disassembled the launcher, they couldn't ignore what they had witnessed. The simplicity of the Katyusha made it almost impossible to stop. Each new test deepened their unease. The Germans had mastered the art of precision warfare, but the Soviets had mastered chaos. By late autumn 1941, the captured Katyusha launcher had become the centerpiece of a secret testing program at a facility near Königsberg. The Germans called it Versuchseinheit R-41, a temporary designation while they studied its design. The engineers had learned much since the first test. The fuel mixture was primitive, based on a simple, solid propellant, yet it burned with tremendous energy. The rocket's construction, though rough, allowed for mass production. There was no delicate mechanism, no rare materials, only steel powder and brute force. As data accumulated, something changed in the atmosphere of the test site. The engineers, once dismissive, began to treat the weapon with quiet respect, even fear. Whenever they prepared a launch, everyone instinctively stepped back, farther than safety guidelines required. The shriek of ignition, that metallic scream rising into a howl, seemed to reach inside their nerves. It was unlike any German artillery sound, less mechanical, more alive. Word of these experiments reached the front lines through rumor and whispers. Soldiers who had fought against Katyusha batteries said the noise alone broke morale before the rockets even landed. Soviet troops called it their revenge song. To the Germans, it became an omen. Panzer commanders reported that during sudden barrages, their tanks shook as if under a hammer. Infantrymen spoke of earth turning to fire in seconds. It wasn't precision that frightened them. It was the overwhelming flood of destruction that came all at once, as if the sky itself had opened. Back at the test range, the engineers decided to measure this psychological effect in their own ranks. They placed microphones to record the launch, studying the frequency and resonance of the rocket's roar. When played back through amplifiers, the sound filled the testing hall, echoing through steel walls like a chorus of screams. The senior engineer, Kepler, noted in his report that no trained soldier could maintain composure under prolonged exposure. For the first time, the Wehrmacht recognized that the Katyusha was not merely a weapon of destruction, it was a weapon of terror. Winter arrived early that year. Snow covered the testing grounds near Königsberg, muting the distant thunder of artillery practice. Inside the facility, the engineers continued their study of the captured Katyusha, now stripped to its bare frame. They measured the angle of its rails, the burn rate of its propellant, the thickness of its steel tubes. Yet the more they examined it, the more they realized that its strength lay not in precision, but in its design philosophy. It was built to be produced fast, in thousands, by workers with minimal training, using whatever materials were available. It was a weapon born from desperation, yet executed with ruthless effectiveness. The German engineers tried to replicate its performance using domestic materials. They substituted the Soviet powder with their own propellant blend, adjusted the nozzle shape, and refined the stabilizer fins. But every improvement they made seemed to make the weapon worse. It became too delicate, too complex to assemble quickly. The very simplicity they had mocked turned out to be its genius. Kepler wrote in his journal that the Soviets had achieved something Germany could not, a perfect balance between chaos and control. Meanwhile, reports from the Eastern Front grew increasingly grim. Soviet rocket batteries, operating in secrecy, were appearing along entire sectors of the front. The Germans would capture one, study it, destroy it, and within weeks a dozen more would appear elsewhere. Entire divisions were being pinned down by rocket salvos that left no time for counterfire. For the first time, the German high command admitted that their troops were psychologically unprepared for this new kind of warfare. In Berlin, scientists at Peenemünde, the birthplace of the Phi-2, were briefed about the Katyusha's field performance. They dismissed it as primitive but effective, an example of how mass firepower could overwhelm precision. Yet among the younger officers, a quiet admiration grew. They understood that the Soviets were fighting a different kind of war, one that relied on momentum, not perfection. As winter deepened, the engineers prepared their most dangerous experiment yet, a live demonstration against captured Soviet armor. A T-34 tank had been brought from the front, scarred and silent, to stand as the next target. The morning of the test was bitterly cold. Frost clung to the hull of the captured T-34 tank, its once red star painted over with German markings for clarity. Around the frozen field, officers, technicians, and artillery experts gathered in heavy coats, their breath visible in the sharp air. This was no ordinary demonstration. The purpose was to prove, beyond doubt, the destructive power of the Soviet rocket. If the Katyusha could breach armor, it would no longer be dismissed as a crude terror weapon. It would be recognized as a revolutionary tool of war. The engineers reassembled the launcher carefully, adjusting its elevation and spacing the rails for accuracy. 6 rockets were prepared, their casings worn but functional. Each was inspected twice. Kepler himself oversaw the wiring. He no longer laughed. There was an unspoken tension among the observers, a sense that what they were about to witness might redefine everything they knew about battlefield firepower. At 10:42, the command was given. The ignition box clicked, and a blinding flash erupted. The rockets screamed into the air, tearing across the snow-covered ground in a sequence so fast it seemed like one continuous roar. Trails of fire and smoke streaked toward the distant target. Within seconds, the T-34 disappeared in a storm of explosions. The ground shook violently. Chunks of ice and mud rained down on the test crew. When the smoke cleared, the tank stood blackened, its turret cracked open, armor plates peeled like metal petals. Silence fell. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The engineers approached cautiously, their boots crunching over debris. The destruction was astonishing. The blast had not pierced the tank directly. Instead, the concussive force had warped the steel, shattered welds, and blown open hatches. The interior was scorched beyond recognition. What heavy artillery could achieve with precision, the Katyusha had done through sheer overwhelming energy. Kepler's report that evening was short but definitive. The rocket's saturation effect compensates for inaccuracy. Against massed armor or fortifications, it is catastrophically efficient. His tone was clinical, but those who read his words felt something deeper, a quiet dread. The weapon they once mocked had just rewritten the rules of war. The destroyed T-34 remained in the snow like a monument to underestimation. For weeks afterward, German engineers and officers returned to the cratered test field, measuring angles, collecting fragments, and photographing every scar on the tank's armor. The data was conclusive. Though the Katyusha lacked the precision of German artillery, its concentrated barrage could devastate fortified positions, vehicles, and morale alike. The engineers began to understand that its true power was not mechanical, it was psychological and strategic. At Peenemünde, specialists compared the Soviet rockets to their own prototypes. The Germans had long pursued guided precision weapons, elegant machines designed for accuracy and efficiency. But the Katyusha represented the opposite philosophy. It required no guidance, no delicate calibration. It relied on fear, numbers, and speed. It did not aim at a single target. It consumed an entire area in seconds. This difference mirrored the broader contrast between the two armies. Germany sought perfection. The Soviet Union sought overwhelming force. As Kepler's findings reached Berlin, interest grew within the Wehrmacht's development divisions. There were discussions about creating a German equivalent, a Nebelwerfer that could rival the Soviet rocket batteries. Experiments began, combining lessons from both sides. Yet even as they developed more advanced systems, the engineers could not forget what they had seen that day. Field reports from the Eastern Front reinforced their memories. Every time Soviet forces unleashed Katyusha barrages, German positions dissolved in confusion. Commanders described entire sectors collapsing before infantry even moved in. Soldiers spoke of sleepless nights, the haunting whistle of distant rockets echoing across the steppe, the ground trembling before dawn. The weapon had become more than a machine. It was an emotion, a symbol of Soviet defiance. Kepler noted in his final winter memorandum that technology alone could not explain it. The Katyusha embodies the will of a nation at war, he wrote. It is not the product of laboratories, but of necessity and fury. The laughter that had once echoed over the first test range was never heard again. By 1943, the German engineers had long abandoned any sense of mockery toward the Katyusha. What had once been dismissed as crude improvisation was now studied with a kind of reverence. Reports from the front described Soviet troops treating their rocket launchers almost like sacred instruments. Crews gave them nicknames, decorated them with painted stars, and sang before launching salvos. For the Red Army, the Katyusha was more than technology. It was a symbol of resilience, a loud answer to invasion. The German High Command, increasingly desperate to regain initiative, commissioned multiple studies comparing the Katyusha's psychological and tactical effects to traditional artillery. The conclusions were chilling. When a battery of Katyushas opened fire, the average German unit suffered a 40% drop in operational coherence within the first 5 minutes. Orders were lost, lines of communication broke, and even seasoned veterans hesitated to advance. The rockets rarely hit precise targets, but precision had never been their purpose. Their value lay in chaos. Back in Königsberg, Kepler and his team prepared a detailed presentation for the Oberkommando des Heer. He described how the Soviets had solved the problem of morale warfare, not by inventing something perfect, but by building something terrifyingly effective. He spoke of the weapon's simplicity, its mobility, and its psychological resonance. The officers listening understood the implications. This was not just a Soviet machine, it was the embodiment of a war fought by an entire nation. Meanwhile, Soviet production ramped up beyond imagination. In factories from Moscow to the Urals, workers labored day and night assembling launchers from whatever material was at hand. Old farm trucks, stripped locomotives, and even tractors were turned into weapons platforms. The German intelligence reports recorded one chilling line: every field can become a Katyusha position. At the front, soldiers spoke of the sky catching fire before major offensives. The Germans knew the sound now all too well, that banshee wail rising over the horizon, signaling that Soviet vengeance had arrived again. And for those who had once laughed at the weapon, the echo of that sound was a reminder of their own arrogance. By 1943, the German engineers had long abandoned any sense of mockery toward the Katyusha. What had once been dismissed as crude improvisation was now studied with a kind of reverence. Reports from the front described Soviet troops treating their rocket launchers almost like sacred instruments. Crews gave them nicknames, decorated them with painted stars, and sang before launching salvos. For the Red Army, the Katyusha was more than technology. It was a symbol of resilience, a loud answer to invasion. The German High Command, increasingly desperate to regain initiative, commissioned multiple studies comparing the Katyusha's psychological and tactical effects to traditional artillery. The conclusions were chilling. When a battery of Katyushas opened fire, the average German unit suffered a 40% drop in operational coherence within the first 5 minutes. Orders were lost, lines of communication broke, and even seasoned veterans hesitated to advance. The rockets rarely hit precise targets, but precision had never been their purpose. Their value lay in chaos. Back in Königsberg, Kepler and his team prepared a detailed presentation for the Oberkommando des Heer. He described how the Soviets had solved the problem of morale warfare, not by inventing something perfect, but by building something terrifyingly effective. He spoke of the weapon's simplicity, its mobility, and its psychological resonance. The officers listening understood the implications. This was not just a Soviet machine. It was the embodiment of a war fought by an entire nation. Meanwhile, Soviet production ramped up beyond imagination. In factories from Moscow to the Urals, workers labored day and night assembling launchers from whatever material was at hand. Old farm trucks, stripped locomotives, and even tractors were turned into weapons platforms. The German intelligence reports recorded one chilling line: every field can become a Katyusha position. At the front, soldiers spoke of the sky catching fire before major offensives. The Germans knew the sound now all too well, that banshee wail rising over the horizon, signaling that Soviet vengeance had arrived again. And for those who had once laughed at the weapon, the echo of that sound was a reminder of their own arrogance. By the summer of 1944, the Red Army had transformed the Katyusha from an experimental terror weapon into a central instrument of its advance. Across the Eastern Front, entire divisions now operated under the cover of coordinated rocket fire. At dawn and dusk, the horizon would erupt with flame as dozens of trucks unleashed their volleys in unison, shaking the earth for miles. The Germans, who once prided themselves on discipline and technological mastery, now found themselves outmatched by something brutally simple, yet impossible to stop. German artillery officers described their frustration in reports. Radar could not track the rockets, counter-battery fire was useless, and reconnaissance aircraft often arrived too late. The Katyushas were gone before the smoke cleared. Their mobility was unmatched. Crews could fire 24 rockets in under 10 seconds, then vanish into the forests, leaving only a field of fire and ruin behind. At the Königsberg test facility, the remaining German engineers gathered one last time to review their findings. The war had changed beyond recognition. Allied bombers roared overhead almost daily, and the front was moving closer with every month. Kepler, older and thinner now, read his final report to a near-empty hall. He spoke not as a scientist, but as a man humbled by what he had witnessed. The Soviet rocket artillery, he wrote, represents not technological superiority, but total dedication. It is a machine built from scarcity and belief. That belief is its true explosive. Even the propaganda divisions of the Reich could not deny what the soldiers were saying. The name Katyusha had become part of military folklore, uttered with fear, resentment, and reluctant respect. Troops could recognize the sound instantly, the rising scream that meant everything could end in seconds. Some claimed they could feel the vibration in their bones before the first explosion hit. As Soviet forces pushed westward, the Katyushas rolled with them like heralds of retribution. Every city they approached echoed with that sound. Every counterattack fell under its shadow. What had begun as laughter in a field outside Smolensk had become the death song of a fading empire. In the final months of the war, as the Red Army surged toward Berlin, the Katyusha's roar became the soundtrack of Germany's collapse. The same weapon that had once drawn laughter from German engineers now filled their nights with dread. Columns of Soviet rocket trucks thundered down the ruined roads of Poland and East Prussia, their rails blackened from constant fire. Wherever they stopped, the air soon trembled with that unmistakable shriek, the voice of vengeance echoing across the ruined landscape of Europe. At the Königsberg test site, silence replaced science. The once proud laboratories stood empty, their instruments abandoned, their charts scattered by the wind. Kepler, the man who had first mocked the crude Soviet launcher, watched as the city prepared for evacuation. He understood now that the Katyusha was not simply a weapon of war. It was a symbol of endurance. It had been forged by people who refused to surrender, who had turned scarcity into strength and desperation into innovation. On the Eastern Front, entire German divisions surrendered under the storm of fire that the Katyusha unleashed in the Battle of Berlin. The rockets tore through streets and buildings, their wild, chaotic energy swallowing any remaining order. Civilians and soldiers alike knew the sound instantly. It was the voice of a war that had come full circle. The weapon built in hidden workshops and carried by ordinary workers had outlasted the empire that once mocked it. After the war, engineers from all sides studied the weapon that had changed the nature of modern artillery. The United States and Britain examined captured launchers. Post-war Germany would later adapt lessons from them into its own designs. Yet none could recreate the emotional power that the original carried. It was more than metal and fuel. It was the will of a nation that had fought for survival. In the decades that followed, the Katyusha remained a symbol across generations, its name invoked with awe and fear. The sound that once made German engineers laugh had become immortal, etched into history as one of the most haunting echoes of the Second World War. And though time has quieted the battlefield, the memory of that scream still lingers, reminding the world that even the simplest weapon can change the course of history.